99.9% of the time, the interpreter is there to make the situation better, not worse, right? I don't say 100% of the time, because we, as interpreters, come to meetings and take on assignments with our own stuff going on in our head too. And if I've left the house and just had a fight with my husband or something, and I come to a job, especially something that's surrounding domestic violence and other types of sensitive family dynamics, it might affect what I'm doing, although it's never intentional. And when interpreters bring in that other dynamic where they bring in a third person into the room with you with what you're doing, it will affect things. It might affect the interpretation. It might affect maybe not the accuracy of the interpretation, but like I mentioned earlier, the affect of it. But it's never intentional. So just keep that in the back of your minds as you're learning to integrate interpreting services into what you guys do. So that being said, we share the same goal. Do no harm. We're there to bridge the communication gap, not to build more walls. I think, I'm sorry, I forget your name in the corner. You were
Chelsea.
talking about the two different scenarios where you thought that you were the third wheel versus the interpreter being the third wheel, right? And so in that instance, I'm not exactly sure what was going on and what the dynamics were in that setting, but that seemed to have thrown up a wall between you and your client. Definitely not something we want to do. So it would be interesting to hear more about that scenario and what you think caused that. So now I'm going to share a little bit about the difference between interpreting and translation. These are not synonymous. Many people think that they are. And outside of the language access world, they'll be used interchangeably, but there's actually a very distinct difference between the two.
Sure. So, for example, I need someone on site here to help me with the Korean-speaking family. So, would you need a translator or you need an interpreter?
Interpreter.
Just a little test.
Interpreter.
Interpreter. Would anyone would say translator? No? Okay. Beth. So Beth has a document that you want to provide, to the family after your meeting, and you need that into Korean. So would you need a translator or an interpreter to work on the document? A translator. Yeah, you all know the answer. So, yeah. So it's very common that, I remember 15 years ago when I went through the medical interpreter training, the instructor kept charging me $5 each time I said it wrong. So I kept saying, the translator when I met an interpreter. So an interpreter is verbal, oral, and translator is in written form. So yeah.
Here's a bonus question. When we talk about in written form, the linguistic term, the interpreting term is in frozen form. Can anybody guess what a frozen form of American Sign Language would be?
Braille? No, that's
No.
blind. No.
Just regular English writing, right? Like a book? No?
No, because it's actually not the same language, right? So English isn't the same as American Sign Language. They're different languages. So it's a stumping question. Actually, a frozen form of ASL would be video.
Oh.
Something that can go back and be reviewed again and again. That doesn't change every time you show it. Like a document's text isn't going to change the same every time you look at it. Just look that out there.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that.
And even probably, Beth, when you put in a request, and even if you accidentally said it, don't feel bad. We get that all the time. We have two departments: translation department, interpreting department,
And that's really
and
clear,
people send a whole bunch of document to interpreting, department and say, I want your interpreter to work on this. People send a request to translation department and wanting someone for a meeting, you know. So
Mhm.
it happens all the time, but we just want you to, you know.
Our favorite is when people request an interrupter.
No, we have enough of those.
So we can respond and say, let us know if they really interrupt you.
Yeah, right. So there are different types of interpreting. Some of these you may have already experienced. You know the on-site, I think you mentioned language line, that would be the phone. Have any of you experienced video remote interpreting before? Okay. Do you know what it is? So it's where you and the non-English speaking person are in the same room, and then you bring in a laptop or an iPad and the interpreter's there remotely. Video relay service, I put this in here because people often confuse video remote with video relay. Has anyone taken a phone call with video relay service interpreting?
Yes. I have.
Probably.
Yeah.
So it's interpreting. The difference is where the interpreter is in the room. And video remote interpreter not in the room. I'm sorry, not the interpreter, the consumers. In video remote, consumers are in the room, the interpreter comes in remotely. In video relay, for ASL, the deaf person and the hearing person are in two completely different places. They could be in different states. It doesn't matter. And then the interpreter is also remote. This is a free service to the deaf community paid for by our taxes, by our TRS funding. Every cell phone bill that we pay has TRS money that goes towards this service.
But when you say that, it's very similar to the phone interpreting. The only thing is that phone interpreting you hear, but then the video relay you see.
Right, well, in video relay, just the interpreter sees the deaf person. So I would have a video phone to talk to the deaf person and a headset. And so I would sign what I hear to the deaf person and then say what I see to the hearing person. I have really good VRS stories to tell, like drug deals and things like that.
Oh.
That's video relay. Video remote is a used for fee service. Depending on what company you use, you might pay per minute, you might pay per 15 minutes. There are tons of VRI companies out there. We offer VRI at Luna, so if that's something that might interest you for those very short moments, a reminder call, a referral someone mentioned earlier, that might be a good use of VRI. Not for counseling, probably not for group. I think it's better to have on-site interpreter there. Tactile, does anybody know what tactile interpreting is?
Mm-mm.
So tactile interpreting is used with people who are deaf and blind.
Oh.
And it's quite amazing to watch, actually. So what will happen is, if I'm the interpreter, my hand goes up underneath the deaf blind person's hand, and they rest on my hand as I sign. And they understand it. It's actually quite amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult if you have someone who's very heavy-handed, because we have to push up
Oh
against
my gosh.
the gravity of their hand and sign. So you might need 2 interpreters if you have something like that. I was a staff interpreter at what is now Aspire. At the time it was Behavior Corps, and we had a group session where we had someone who was deaf and blind, and it added more to our role as the interpreter, because not only were we interpreting verbal noise and comments and audio cues and things like that, we were also interpreting visual cues. So, a woman walked in the room or something like that, so that the deaf blind woman had a better idea of what she was sitting in the group. Very interesting.
And they communicate back with you through
Just
sign.
sign.
Interesting.
There's even a type of tactile where it's primarily for deaf blind people who present. It always floors me to see these people who have so many barriers in their life, but go on to get their masters and PhDs and become national presenters. And when a deaf blind person presents, there's someone that comes up behind them, and there's a way of tactile interpreting on their back, so that they know, like, if they know if people come in and out of the room, that the interpreter will tell them if somebody's yawning
Oh.
or if someone's looking at their phone or something like that. So it gives them cues as to what's happening interpersonally in the room. And then if someone has to sign to them, then they come around and they do tactile on their hands. Very fascinating to watch.
That is amazing.
Yeah, it's very amazing. And for those of you who have worked with deaf community members, have you used a certified deaf interpreter? So a certified deaf interpreter, CDI, I could see it happening, especially if you work with deaf children. CDIs come in, they're deaf. They are, they've gone through special training to become a certified interpreter, and we bring them into settings where we call it idiosyncratic signing. So in situations where maybe it's, we do have a Burmese deaf gentleman that we work with. So ASL is not even his second language, it's down on the list. Or we work with people who may not have any language at all, they've just used home signs all of their life. We bring them in legal settings with juveniles, with deaf juveniles, always. We bring in CDIs to the courts whenever we have a deaf juvenile, because the native nuances are picked up much easier by someone who is also deaf. That means that you actually need to hire two interpreters, right? Because you have the deaf interpreter and then you have their hearing counterpart who is feeding information, feeding the message to the deaf interpreter, who then turns and reworks it and produces it in a way that would pass through the barriers that are there with the idiosyncratic sighting. So I could see conceivably, for those of you who work in the courts, for those of you who work with children, a need for CDI. You may already know this, we won't spend a lot of time here, but the three very specific laws that pertain to language access, the Civil Rights Act, this is one that you think would have more teeth than language access. People don't think that the Civil Rights Act has anything to do with language access, but it absolutely does, particularly in the hospitals and courts, and it really brings anything that's federally funded should have an interpreter of someone who doesn't speak English. That's kind of the basis of it. Then we have the ADA, that's what gives me my job. That's what requires American Sign Language interpreters. And then the Affordable Care Act has come along behind the Civil Rights Act to give more teeth, more emphasis, more incentive for companies to bring in interpreting services when needed. Yeah.
For the Civil Rights Act, what happens? Well, what is the language in the law? Does it say that a federally funded program or entity has to provide an interpreter if requested?
It's phrased not as an interpreter, it's phrased under a statement of discrimination. So someone cannot be discriminated against because of race, gender, ethnicity, language. So it falls under that statement. How it's, quote, interpreted to each company is different. I'm more familiar with the ADA because that's what affects and impacts my part of this language communication world. And the ADA, it talks about a reasonable accommodation, and what's reasonable and what is actually accommodation is sometimes, again, up for interpretation. If you're interested, I can send you the link, or I can send you the portion of the Civil Rights Act that talks specifically about this, if you're interested. It's a call to not discriminate. And then underneath that, kind of like a sub-tenet of that, is the communication part.
Okay.
We're gonna skip that. That was another video. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ethics that ASL interpreters fall under, and then I'm going to give it over to Na, and she's going to talk about the spoken language interpreting ethics. You would think they would be pretty similar. And for the most part, they are. There's one big difference, though, between what ASL interpreters are called to do and spoken language interpreters are called to do, and that is advocacy. ASL interpreters are not called to advocate. This is a big difference. It's all about advocacy in the spoken language world. This is primarily because the deaf community is saying that they don't want people to advocate on their behalf. That's not the interpreter's role. The interpreter's role is simply to be a conduit. We're just there to pass the message along, and to advocate, to step out of that role is doubly oppressive to the deaf community. Now, I can make a case that advocacy is a part of all of these tenets for us. We keep things confidential. We have to have the skills needed for the job, appropriate behavior on the job, respect for consumers, respect for other interpreters, ethical business practices, and professional development to make sure we keep up on our skills. There's a little bit of advocacy in all of that. But it's not something that is spoken about in the ASL and deaf communities, that is the role of the interpreter. It just isn't. So this is what the ethics look like for spoken language interpreters.
So yeah, for the spoken language interpreters, we of course mainly work with the population that are possibly from another countries. So first, they're not familiar with the healthcare system here, how things work, and all of that. So a lot of time as spoken language interpreters, when there are times, for example, in Burma, when someone is sick and diagnosed with a very serious, say, stage 4 cancer, the first person the doctor is going to talk to is the family member, which is completely different than here. So a lot of time, interpreters has to jump in and just advocate the provider and inform the provider that in this particular country, people are not informed of their situation. Sometimes people died without even knowing what their health issue was in Burma. So I have worked with some patients that will ask the doctor, please tell me the truth. I don't want my family member to know, but not me knowing what is going on with me, because it happened all the time in our country. So those are the time when the interpreter would jump in and help the provider understand what the background are. So our interpreters are trained. A lot of time we are asked, especially agencies like you, when we take the request and we want to be sure the interpreter knows what the case is, what the interpreting is for, and if we can provide them patient's name and situations and things like that. And a lot of time we get a little pushback and say that, oh, we can't provide you the name of the family, the name of the patient, because of the confidentiality. And interpreters are all trained and went through the HIPAA training and have signed all of this agreement when it comes to confidentiality. So you can feel free to provide the patient's name, the details of the case, and things like that.
Okay, hold up there.
Yes.
Because normally when I book something for them, they ask, can I have they say the patient's name, we don't have patients here, but, and I say, I'm sorry, we don't share that information. Is it okay now, hearing this, to share it, or should we continue with that practice?
So unless you guys need it, my preference would be to still do that. Obviously, when you're in the room, you're going to meet that person, and then you're going to know that information. Right. But then I feel like our client then has more control over that, unless we've gotten a release, which typically we don't beforehand. So the laws that we are under is the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, requires us to keep everything confidential. We don't have permission to share anything without a signed release. So even if it is to another confidential person, somebody who has been trained in confidentiality, we typically don't.
I think that if you can't give us the name, the gender, I think would make a big difference.
I request a specific gender.
Okay.
If not a specific interpreter, then a specific gender.
It also happens sometimes with smaller communities, such as Burmese. I mean, I say smaller just because we are about 19,000 in Indianapolis, but it's still very tight and community that we know each other and we go to the same church and things like that. So So it helps when we see the
Mhm.
name and we don't send.
The
There
same.
are times that interpreter will call us back and say, oh,
I know that
I
person.
just got here, I see this family, there is a conflict of interest and I cannot interpret for this family. So
Yeah.
it just takes extra time for us to
Yeah.
find another one.
Good point.
You know, so it, I mean, and again, if you, provide either like first name, the only part is that when you provide first name, there are a lot of vans in the Burmese, probably the same thing with Spanish and,
Mhm.
many languages as well that, a lot of us have the same first and the same last name, so, in case you can provide that, that helps. If not, then, we will do our best to, to work on the request. And, interpreters are trained, to provide, services in accuracy, impartiality, all of, this list. And of course, there may be time that when it comes to a different situation, you will see that, Chelsea, there are times that you will see that, or maybe Paula, the conversation may go longer than, you just ask, how long has it been, have you been hurting, and the conversation will keep going on and on. So that, it could be two things, one thing could be that the family, the patient is just, going back to 10 years ago stories, or maybe, the interpreter may not ask the right question. So it's always, good to rephrase and, talk about it. I interpret myself, and there are times the doctor is like, I only asked when did the knee start hurting, and the patient started going back to like, oh, when I was in Burma, I went to the firm and I fell, and all of that story take, of course, more than 7 years or 2 years,
It's also, in ASL, because of the linguistic nature of the language, interpreters expand quite a bit when we ask questions, which could look like a dialogue with a deaf person. Let me give you an example. If somebody asks, how do you take your medicine? There's not a great way to sign that in ASL. So what an interpreter will do is we'll sign your medicine. Is it a pill? Is it a syrup? Is it a shot? Is it in the eyes? Is it in the nose? And we give all those options. And then they choose from that option. And so what may look like a little bit of signing on the side is really an interpreter choice to expand so that we can get more concise information back. Just an example. Just one other quick example in the ASL world in terms of advocacy or not advocacy. The way that we report tests being positive or negative in ASL does not translate really well, because those signs are positive and negative signs are also used for a positive mood or a negative mood, something like that. So when, let's say, a pregnancy test comes back negative, we don't sign your test as negative, because depending on the person's life happening in that moment, a positive pregnancy test may be a positive thing, it may be a negative thing for them, right? So, but instead of explaining that and taking the advocacy route and bringing this cultural mediation route into what's happening, we just alter the way we sign it. And we'll just sign, are you pregnant, not pregnant, versus positive, negative.
Interesting.
So, these are the things that, all of us as interpreters, we are trained, and we have the do's and don'ts that we have to follow as working with agency, as a contractor or as a staff. So, you may have already, used this when you have interpreter in your team, but it helps when you work with the interpreter and the patient. There are 3 people in the room. It's always helped as provider when you look at straight to the patient, the person you're talking to. In fact, spoken language interpreters, we are trained to stand or to sit behind the patient. That way the provider and the patient can have direct eye contact. But the problem is a lot of time we have patients that will look back and, you know, will turn even, will move their chair and then, you know, they feel better when they look at the interpreter's face. But still, you know, by having the eye contact between the provider and the patient helps. And then introduce yourself to both interpreter and the patient as who, you know, what are you going to do with the patient that day. And then ask questions if you think there might be, you know, cultural issue. If you just during, you know, the session, if you realize that something is not, you know, right, maybe, you know, I'm asked quite often when Burmese patients are not looking at the provider's eyes. So that's when
Can I help you?
the provider will start asking, and I'll be like, you know, especially in our culture, to show the respect, we look down and we don't have eye contact, and it's completely different than the culture here. So that the provider understand, oh, no wonder, you know, they never look at me, they look down or look somewhere else when they talk. So it's nothing to like not to pay attention, but actually, you know, that's a part of the culture. And also, it helps if you know you are gonna have a very complex situation that would need a lot of, you know, time or a lot of explanation, and just, you know, maybe meet the interpreter a few minutes before the session start and introduce what are we going to talk about and discuss about in that particular meeting. And also after, you know, the session, it also helps just to get, you know, what happened in the interpreting session, and, you know, to just regroup a little bit after the session. A lot of time, because of the interpreting, you know, interpreter has to spend almost as much time as the, you know, the provider speaks. So we just have to schedule it a little, you know, spacing out, just so we have enough time for the interpreter. And feel free to ask about the interpreter credential if you have any, you know, I mean, everybody that we've already onboarded has to, you know, pass necessary tests and go through some, you know, certain amounts of hours of training. But you never know, somebody may just decide to not follow the protocol, and, you know, if you ever have that in mind, then, you know, feel free to ask for the credential.
This, I mean, just really quickly, this is really important when you're working in the court system. So if you're going to court and you're using an interpreter there, that interpreter needs to be court certified. And there are, for Luna, for ASL in particular, we only send certified people to court. There are other agencies where they're a little more flexible with that, but it's important, not only because you're ensuring the skill level of the interpreter, but if something goes horribly wrong, which we hope it doesn't, but if something does, the fact that the interpreter is certified gives us a grievance process to follow if something happens. So.
Thank you, Beth. And also, a lot of time, interpreters may raise their hands and to verify, you know, some conversation or some phrases or words. For example, in the Burmese language, in Burma, health insurance doesn't exist. So when you interpret about, you know, when you say your health insurance, then you have to actually, like, you know, define it and say it in a way that the person will understand. So it's like, okay, it's an agreement. So your healthcare, you know, treatment will be paid. You know, you have to say it in a long way like that. So there will be a lot of times and terms that interpreter may verify. So it doesn't necessarily mean that sometimes we get, you know, feedback saying that, oh, your interpreter doesn't even know this word and they want to verify. So of course, you know, obvious that people should know pap smear and mammogram and, you know, those tests, but then where there are certain or, you know, particular phrases are used, they may want to verify that.
Is that, I was gonna say, is that the plug into this cord?
I think, well, I can't get the computer up.
Is that our cord?
No. It's,
Oh, okay.
It's the charging.
Oh, got it.
That's, I can finish thou shalt not. Did you want to say anything more?
No, you, if I can add
Please
just,
do.
one thing. When we talk about the professional development and, you know, continuing education, working with an agency, all our interpreters, we have a system that document every single job that interpreter takes. So for example, if I run 15 minutes late to my appointment, then that is being recorded. If I got a negative feedback about my interpretation this week, then that is being documented. So we have a system that, you know, keep track of that. So when an interpreter is at the point that needed to, you know, provide extra coaching, if we have to provide extra coaching, then we do provide extra coaching. That way the interpreter is being, you know, monitored and work closely with our staff or our experienced interpreter. And after, you know, after those sessions, and if interpreters did decide not to improve, then a lot of time we have to, you know, stop working with those particular interpreters. So know that the development and continued education are always required for every single interpreter that work with us.
And you rely on the people asking for the interpreters and working with the interpreters to get that feedback.
Exactly. So actually, we have it in our in Daoxiao. Is also that negative, positive feedback are always welcome. Otherwise, you know, we won't know. Even if you have like this little, you know, a little bit of, you know, you don't feel so good about that, and you know, just give us, you know, a quick email or a quick phone call and say, hey, you know, I actually felt like the interpreter could do better, and you know, those are always appreciated. So we can, you know, talk with the interpreter and improve that.
Great.
It's also important too because interpreters are generalists, meaning that we go into different venues all throughout the day, and because we're not specialists, that means that you obviously know so much more about your area of treatment than we do. And if an interpreter is violating something that is important to you and with your consumers, you said you didn't call them patients, are you clients?
Clients.
Clients, okay. With your clients, which is something that is so clear they shouldn't be doing based on your ethics and based on what you know to be true about your clients, it may not have even occurred to that interpreter. There's a story of a sign language interpreter, didn't have a lot of background in mental health, and went to interpret a pretty serious session. And the interpreter didn't even notice that what he was doing was fingerspelling the word therapist, but putting a slight pause, very, very slight pause between THE and RAPIST. And it was just a way the person fingerspelled. It wasn't meant to separate to say the rapist, but that's what was being fingerspelled. That's how the deaf consumer read the fingerspelling. And I think if that person had been a little more savvy in the mental health world, probably, you know, then they would have been a little more conscious about how they